Hello everyone and welcome back to the Codex. Today we're going to be talking about the enemy status rework and armor changes, health changes, etc. All those kind of things. Basically the full damage rework that the game has received. Let's hop into the arsenal here and discuss a few things. So before I show anything, first we got to go over some of the baseline changes that they have made. Enemy armor has been heavily reduced and capped to 2700. Now, for example, a level 200 Corrupted Heavy Gunner on Steel Path used to have something like 25,000 already by that level. So their armor has been massively reduced, although they do have more actual base health to somewhat compensate. Their total EHP, which means effective health points, is still lower overall, but they do have more actual raw health. And fun fact, they also have minimum armor of 200. And when I say minimum, I mean that's what they spawn with. You can still armor strip enemies, but the lowest that an enemy will spawn with is 200, and the highest that they can get to is 2700. Now, 2700 armor is exactly a 90% damage reduction. So there's some interesting things about that when it comes to build math and what you actually build around now versus like armor stripping, not stripping, ignoring armor, things like that. But we'll get to that. So instead of the 13 different health types and the multiple kinds of armor, different kinds of shields that enemies used to have. They've collapsed everything now and heavily simplified it. There's now just health, armor, shields, and overguard. And it doesn't matter what kind of enemy it is. Health is health, armor is armor, so on, so on. Those only matter now. Those distinctions only matter for the purposes of how status effects interact with them. For example, armor matters because corrosive strips armor. So if they have armor, whatever it is, it'll strip it, which is already what it did, but just as an example. The damage bonuses against enemies are now faction-based rather than health type-based. So, for example, it used to be that Grineer with ferrite armor on were weak to corrosive by 75% because of the ferrite armor. Then if you fully stripped them all the way, if they had no armor, they would have the Grineer cloned flesh. So you then had the different damage modifiers for that. Like, for example, viral damage doing more damage against them. And then some other Grineer, the heavier Grineer, like Bombards, had alloy armor, which was instead weak to radiation. So radiation would do extra damage against that, but then you still had their different flesh-type modifiers underneath that if you were to strip them. That's all gone. Now, when it says, for example, if I go into here, and go look at corrosive on the Occucore, for example. If you hover over status types now, it shows the new damage efficacy charts. It says times 1.5 damage to Grineer and Cubic Grineer in the case of corrosive. And then it only does times 0.5 as in half damage to sentience. What that means is, when this says that corrosive does extra damage to Grineer, whether they have armor or not, corrosive will do 150% of its total damage. So even if you're using emerald shards, for example, and you fully strip a bombard or a heavy gunner, etc., to the point where they have no armor and they just have flesh, or health rather, you still get this corrosive damage bonus because it's now faction based and not health type based. So that really changes things because it used to be that if you were fully stripping with corrosive, you would actually lose your damage bonus because they no longer have the defensive layer that receive extra damage from the damage type. That's gone, so that means that you could use emerald shards, and I think that this just further reinforces the meta essentially of how good emerald shards are because against at least specifically Grineer and Kuva Grineer, for example, this means that you can get bonus damage against them, take off all of their armor, and you still get that full bonus damage against them, even though you also just multiplied your damage by up to 10x, basically, by taking off up to 2700 armor. So that is an interesting thing. Speaking of armor, another thing to consider when it comes to specifically Emerald Shards is that now that enemies are capped at 2700 armor, that means that there is a real consideration for using just a singular Tau Forged Emerald Archon Shard. Using one Tau Forged Emerald Archon Shard gives you +3 corrosive stacks, which means that you get 13 corrosive procs in an enemy. 13 corrosive procs is just on the edge of fully stripping them. That's a 98% armor strip. So now that enemies have an actual hard cap of 2700, that means that if you strip them 98%, the max amount of armor that they could have would be 54 armor. 54 armor is only an 18% EHP increase. So, for example, if an enemy had 1 million raw health, and then you strip them down to only having 54 armor, that 1 million health is still only worth 1,180,000 because they only gain 18%. And with the amount of damage that we do, that's basically irrelevant. So, as opposed to using 2 emerald shards to fully strip, you could save that 1 shard slot and use something else like more strength or parkour velocity or etc., whatever you want for your build, and just use the 1 Talport shard and still get a massive damage increase. Because at that point, if you think about it, going from going from having no shards to that first Tau shard is a huge damage increase. But going from the enemy only having an 18% EHP bump down to 0 is not a huge damage increase. So there's a real consideration there for thinking about how you're putting your builds together. Now let's go ahead and talk about some of the actual status changes. Blast damage here, for example. Go to my Blast Core build. The new Blast status effect is Blast deals 30% of base damage after 1.5 seconds as an explosion. And then after 10 stacks, as in, so hitting 10 stacks, or on them dying, stacks deal their damage simultaneously to enemies within 5 meters while staggering them. So if you can hit that 10 stack fast enough, like how you can very easily do it on the Core and repeatedly set that off, you now get basically some extra AoE damage from Blast, and especially on someone specifically like Saren, who you can build a weapon like this for Blast, and then get corrosive damage from Venom Dose for free corrosive, and then you have Emerald Shards on to fully strip them. You now have a situation in which you have enemies that have no armor and are constantly exploding into AoE and hurting the enemies around them. So let's show how crazy that is. First, I'm going to spawn in some weaker enemies, just to get my stacks up here, so you guys don't have to wait for me to do that. Let's pop Venom Dose and Toxic Lash. And these kills right here don't matter because they're only level 50, so ignore that. And now we're going to summon the full level 225 Corrupted Heavy Gunners with Steel Path modifiers. And take a look at this. As you can see, it works. Now, whether or not, how much of that damage you think is the blast portion rather than just Saren being amazing herself. It's like you already have the toxin damage, you're stripping armor, so you'd probably kill them fast anyway, but you do get that extra AoE. What I can show you that showcases the fact that Blast itself is actually amazing. Let's go ahead and take Saren off so you know I'm not using any buffs. The Halakar here, I bet you wouldn't have thought that you would see the day where the Halakar can enter the meta. So, as most of you probably already know, every thrown melee in the game has a forced status proc. The forced proc for the Halakar is a blast proc. So when you pair that with modding for electric, and then you add melee influence, and then we're using the new mod, Melee Elementalist, which gives you 90% status damage, along with the heavy attack windup speed, which is nice. Which, speaking of that, by the way, you could drop Amalgam Orchid Shatter back for regular Orchid Shatter, get a little bit of crit damage back, since you're already getting that same 60% heavy attack windup speed that you are from this. Although they do stack, and it is a little faster, so it's up to you. Let's take a look at just what the Halakar can do entirely by itself. First, let's make sure we got 20 enemies here. Now, you're going to have to wait for that melee influence to go off, of course, so you got to get that electric proc, which I got right away. So now, watch this. Wow. Yeah, that is the power of Blast now, when used appropriately. So the kind of things that can really take advantage of that are weapons like this, where you can have a forced massive damage blast proc, or something like a beam weapon like the Core, where you can rapidly apply a blast to hit that 10 stack over and over and over again super fast to constantly set off those 5-meter AoE explosions. Now, the reason why this is so strong with melee influence is because when you think about how melee influence works, once it triggers, you share the status effects that one enemy takes to all the surrounding enemies. So if you're applying even just a single blast status, but in an AoE, each enemy receiving one blast status is giving all of the enemies around them that one blast status. So if each enemy is doing that to every other enemy around them, by applying one blast status in a crowd, you can share 10 blast statuses almost instantaneously from a single throw because they're all sharing to each other. And that's why you get that massive damage feedback that you just saw there with the Halakar. So Blast is definitely much better now. Cold also got some nice changes. Not as mechanically different as how they made blasts, but let's look at cold here. Cold causes, I can't read today, enemies to move and attack slower for each stack and will completely freeze for 3 seconds upon reaching 10 stacks. Increase critical damage by 10% on the first stack with an additional 5% per stack. This effect doubles when frozen. So previously, cold procs would give you a 0.5x crit multiplier increase. Now it's effectively a 1x crit multi increase. So you do get a nice little crit damage increase from that. And the really interesting thing now is the new totally freezing enemies solid effect that you can get. That's obviously good crowd control. Now, the damage efficacy is a little worse than it used to be. And now it's just extra damage to sentience. It used to be like extra damage against alloy armor, which doesn't exist anymore, for example. But still, just the effects of cold itself are good. And the fact that it doesn't have any damage negatives is also really good. It may not have 1.5x damage to any enemies that you commonly fight, but it also doesn't do any less damage to any enemies in the game. So that is a nice consideration. And then there's Magnetic here, which does extra damage to Corpus and a Corpus Amalgam and less to Armor. And Armor don't really matter because you almost never fight them. Now, the new effect of Magnetic, let's read this. Magnetic increases shield damage by up to 325% with multiple stacks, which is not new. That's what it used to do. And disables the target's shield generation for a short duration. Here's the new and really cool part. When shield or overguard breaks, deal electricity damage for 3% of enemies' max shield or overguard per stack with a forced electric status effect. Also, it doesn't say it here, but Magnetic also now does more damage against overguard specifically. It doesn't say that in the damage efficacy up top because overguard isn't a faction type. It's like a health type, but keep that in mind. It does do extra damage to overguard now. So, there's two things that are really important here. Three things. One, it just does more damage to overguard, which is obviously nice for Eximus. Secondly, Magnetic now has a nice AoE damage bump from whenever you collapse an enemy's overguard or shields, you get that electric proc, and that'll do damage to the enemy that you're actually primarily shooting, and since electric procs are AoE, it'll also add some AoE damage. And thirdly, the really fun part, since Magnetic is now proccing Electric, which is a different status effect, that means that if you weren't already modding for Electric, that's one extra status type for mods like Galvanized Aptitude, which give you extra damage to your weapon per unique type of status you put on the enemy. So right now I'm modded for Corrosive, Magnetic, Cold, and Radiation, which is 4 different status effects, which means that Galvanized Aptitude gives me that 80% damage bonus 4 times. So that's 8, 16, 24, 32, 320% damage. But whenever I shoot an enemy that has shields or overguard, and I pop that electric proc, that's now a 5th status type. So that 320% damage goes up to 400% damage, because I'm getting another 80% from adding a 5th elemental status type. So that's really good, especially on weapons like this, where it's a Tenet or a Kuva weapon, and you can get Magnetic as a free element via the Progenitor system. Like, you can have Magnetic built into any of those weapons by choosing that as your Progenitor Warframe when you're making them. And since you wouldn't typically mod for Magnetic, it's basically a free element. That's why people do it. And it's a combined element, so it won't interfere with your regular modding, no matter what elemental mods you put on here. So it's even better now as a sort of priming element for making the galvanized mods better, the condition overload style effect. So that is really cool. And let's go ahead and show that Galaxion in action. Let's go ahead and pull out some Eximus enemies. That way you can see the electric effect against enemies like that from the new status. Oops, that's not Eximus. Let's pull out some Eximus heavy gunners here. I'm going to lower the level a little bit just so you can see a slightly faster kill rate here to really see the effects of the proc. There we go. Well, now my cat's proccing, so it's giving me those orange crits, so this is a little more damage than they would usually do, of course. But still, you can see, watch what happens when that breaks. See, now there's a single electric proc on there. And it does scaling damage, again, based off of the amount of overguard or shields that they had. So it does more and more damage as the enemy is higher level and has higher values on either of those two things there. So as you can see, it's definitely interesting. I need this cat proc to wear off, though, so I can stop orange critting. But yeah, especially if your cat makes you orange crit, the Tenet Galaxion is definitely a good weapon. Who would have thunk it? There we go. Now that's worn off. Let's go ahead and resummon those enemies so we can get a more accurate test without the cat making me go insane there. As you can see, still quite good. Again, these are level 150 on Steel Path. And this is without any kind of buffs, so especially if you threw this on something like Saren, or you had a Roar, or Zada's Whisper, any kind of Warframe buff, or armor stripping, throw on Emerald Shards, this becomes a lot crazier. In fact, let's go ahead and throw on a frame with 2 Emerald Shards on, so you can see how something like this performs when you are totally taking their armor off passively. And since we're doing that, actually, let's put them all the way back up to level 225. So armor, it doesn't matter as much anymore, but it definitely still matters. Taking off all of an enemy's armor is still a large damage increase, especially when they get to a high enough level where they have that full 2700. So as you can see, this performs just fine once you take their armor off. I do love the Tentaglaxion. Now some other interesting things to go over. The enemies with shields, speaking of that, enemies with shields now have faster shield recharge delay. That won't really matter a whole lot if you just use Toxin, but do keep that in mind. Also, fun fact, apparently we've been fighting bugged Corpus the entire time. Corpus on Steel Path had the Steel Path modifier applied twice, so they had over 6 times the shields. Now they just have the proper 2.5 times that they're supposed to have for Steel Path modifiers. So that's good. And let's see here. I'm just double checking the patch notes to make sure I don't miss anything for you guys. You know what we should do? Let's go hop over to navigation for just a moment here, and I'll show you what I was talking about with the the status effects being, not status effects, the status damages being dependent upon the faction now rather than health and armor types. So here we are at navigation. And let's take a look at the Kuva Fortress, for example. So, some of these sub-factions in the game, not some of them, all of them, less like the Kuva, the Deimos Infested, things like that, they have different weaknesses than the regular faction. Like Kuva Grineer are weak to corrosive and impact, and they're resistant to heat damage. But regular Grineer, if we go to somewhere like Sedna, they are weak again to impact and corrosive, but they don't have that heat resistance. So that's a little different. You can see how, like here's one mission where both of them exist, where the Kuva Grineer have the same weaknesses, but they're a little stronger in the sense that they're resistant to heat. So even though they still just have, health, armor, whatever, because the faction subtype is different, that is now what determines the damaging types. One location where that's really interesting is, as you guys know if you've seen my Make Plat and Omnia Fishers video, the Circulus mission on Lua, the Conjunction Survival. Previously, on a mission like that, you would have infested Grineer and Corpus enemies. They're all corrupted because they're mind-controlled by the Void and whatnot, but they still had the different infested health types, armor types, and then the Corpus would have shields or health or whatnot, and then the Grineer would have their different alloy and ferrite armor and Grineer health and all that. So there would be different damage considerations for the different enemies even within a single mission with how it used to work. But now that it's just faction-based, the Orokin, all as a whole, are specifically weak to puncture and viral and resistant to radiation. So if you mod for viral and you come to this mission, that means that no matter who you're shooting, whether it's a Grineer with armor, a Corpus with their shields on, or an infested, since they all count as Orokin in this mission, they all take more damage from viral and less damage from radiation. So that's an interesting simplification in a way of how you can design your builds based around particular missions or planets or factions more accurately, as opposed to how we used to do it. So that was a little bit of just a rundown there. It looks like there's a hotfix coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and end the video here, because that's most of the information anyway. Let me know down below, what kind of things do you guys want to see, given the major changes that we've received with this status update. What kind of builds do you guys think need reworked? And what things should we experiment with to see what's effective now with the new metas, new methodologies, and what do you think is no longer effective, maybe that used to be? Let me know now down below, and I will make sure that I test all of those interesting kind of concepts for you guys. Anyways, I will see you guys in the next one.